Have you ever tried to force something to happen, only to find it slipping further out of your grasp? Whether it's a job, a relationship, or a dream, we often push ourselves to control every outcome, believing that the harder we try, the faster we'll reach our goal. But what if the key to finding peace and success isn't in forcing things, but in letting go, waiting, and trusting God? This message is about surrendering our need to control and learning to trust God's timing. In a world that demands instant results, it's easy to forget that sometimes the best thing we can do is wait. Proverbs 3:5-6 tells us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." Waiting on God isn't about passively sitting back. It's about actively trusting that he has a better plan and timing for our lives. Think about those moments in your own life when you felt overwhelmed or uncertain. You may have tried everything, but things still didn't fall into place. How often do we get caught in the trap of forcing things, only to end up disappointed? Trusting God isn't always easy, but when we surrender our own timing, he brings peace and clarity. Write in the comments, "I trust God's timing." This action represents your commitment to stop forcing and to start trusting. If you haven't subscribed yet, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss any content. Let's get started. Number 1. Let go of control. How many of you have ever tried to control everything in your life? Perhaps you've tried to orchestrate every detail, believing that if you could just make it all work out, things would be better. Maybe you've tried to hold on to your circumstances, thinking that your effort to control will bring the peace you desperately crave. But let me ask you this: does it work? Does forcing things ever bring the peace you desire? If you're like most of us, the answer is no. We often find ourselves tangled in our own attempts to control, only to realize that we're spinning in circles, exhausted, anxious, and feeling more distant from the peace we seek. I'm sure you've been there, feeling like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. You see a situation, and you think, "I have to fix this. I have to control this." It's almost as if you're trying to hold the reins of your life so tightly, not realizing that the more you grip, the more you lose control. But I want to tell you something today that might sound counterintuitive. Letting go doesn't mean weakness. It means surrendering to the strength that comes from trusting in something greater than yourself. In fact, letting go is the key to finding true peace. God never intended for you to bear the weight of everything alone. He never meant for you to fight your battles on your own. There's an invitation for you to release the need for control and trust in his ability to lead you through your life's journey. Think about it for a moment. How many times have we tried to control our relationships, our finances, our careers, or even our health? We hold tightly to the idea that if we just try harder, work longer, or push through, everything will fall into place. But what if, instead of pushing and forcing, we stopped and trusted that God is already in control? The Bible speaks about this in so many ways. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." When we try to control everything, we're essentially leaning on our own understanding, our own limited perspective. But God's understanding is infinite. His ways are beyond ours. And the beauty of this verse is that it tells us, "In all your ways submit to him." This means that when you're trying to control something, whether it's a relationship, your work, or your future, let go. Let God take the lead, because he can see the way when we can't. This isn't an easy thing to do. Trusting God with your life, with your plans, with your dreams, it can feel scary, but I want to encourage you today to take that step. Let go of the need to control everything and trust that God's plan is bigger than anything you could ever imagine. He's not just there to watch you struggle. He's there to help you navigate through the challenges with his wisdom and guidance. Let me take you to another part of the Bible that speaks to this same principle. Psalm 55:22 says, "Cast your cares on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never let the righteous be shaken." What a powerful reminder that we don't have to carry our burdens alone. God doesn't just ask us to give him our worries. He promises to sustain us through them. When you let go and trust him with your cares, he holds you up. When you release your worries, he strengthens you. Imagine the relief you could experience if you truly allowed yourself to trust God with everything, your fears, your desires, your uncertainties. You don't have to figure it all out on your own. You don't have to have all the answers. God has a plan, and his plan is far greater than anything you could do on your own. Now, I want to speak to those of you who are struggling to let go. Maybe you're holding on to something because it feels like if you don't, you'll lose everything. You've been trying to control your circumstances for so long that it's become a part of you. But here's the truth. You're not meant to carry that weight. You don't have to hold everything in your life with a tight grip. When we try to control, we only end up stressing ourselves out. When we surrender, we allow God to step in and take over, bringing peace in the process. Let's look at the example of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He knew the pain he was about to face, and yet he prayed to his Father in Luke 22:42, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Even Jesus, in his humanity, had to let go of his own desires and surrender to God's will. He trusted that God's plan, though it was painful, was better than anything he could control. Sometimes God will ask us to walk through difficult seasons. But what he promises is that he will never leave us. He will never let us fall. Just like Jesus trusted his Father's plan, we too must trust that God knows what's best for us, even when we can't see it at the moment. What would happen in your life if you stopped trying to control everything? What if you stopped worrying about what's next and let God take the lead? What if you just let go, surrendered, and trusted in the one who holds your future in his hands? It's hard, I know. It's so easy to want to hold on, to keep things in our grip. But the more you try to control, the more you'll realize how little power you truly have. It's not in your hands, but in God's. And when you let go, when you trust him with your life, that's when you'll experience the peace that surpasses all understanding. The Bible tells us in Isaiah 55:8-9, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God's plan is not like ours. It's greater. It's perfect. And when we stop trying to control and trust him, we open ourselves to his perfect plan unfolding in our lives. Take a moment to reflect on your own life. What are you holding on to right now? What have you been trying to control that's causing you anxiety and stress? Can you take a step back and surrender it to God? Let go of the burden you were never meant to carry. Let go of the fear, the worry, the uncertainty, and trust that God is already at work. God is faithful, and he will never leave you or forsake you. You don't have to control everything. Trust in the one who holds it all together. Let go and let him lead you. Number 2, trust in the unseen. Have you ever found yourself standing at a crossroads with no idea which way to go? You look to the left, you look to the right, but the road ahead remains unclear. It's easy to trust in something when we can see it, when we know what's coming, when the path is clearly laid out before us. But what happens when the future is uncertain, when the answers aren't obvious, and all we're left with is blind faith? I know many of you are struggling with uncertainty. You might feel like you're walking in the dark, unable to see what's next. Maybe you've been praying for answers, but they don't seem to come. Maybe you've been working tirelessly, but the results feel out of reach. The world tells us that if we can't see it, it's not real. But what if faith wasn't about seeing, but trusting in what we cannot yet perceive? What if the unseen is where God is working the most? We often talk about faith, but true faith is trusting in something we can't see, something we don't yet understand. And that's hard, isn't it? It's so much easier to trust what we can see with our eyes, to rely on what's tangible. But God calls us to trust in Him, even when the way is hidden from view. In 2 Corinthians 5:7, we are reminded, "For we live by faith, not by sight." This verse doesn't just tell us to believe when we can see, it challenges us to believe when we can't see, to trust when everything feels uncertain. Life isn't always about having a clear vision of the future. It's about trusting that God is already there, even when we can't see the path ahead. Take a moment to reflect on the times in your life when you've had to trust God without knowing the outcome. Maybe you've faced a major life decision, or maybe you've been in a season of waiting, not knowing when things would turn around. It's in those moments that God asks us to trust Him fully. It's in the unseen moments that our faith is truly tested. Let's take a closer look at the life of Joseph. Joseph's story is one of incredible trust, even when the path ahead seemed impossible. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused and imprisoned. From the outside, it seemed like his life was falling apart, but in the midst of the uncertainty, God was working behind the scenes. Joseph couldn't see it, but God had a plan. And in the end, Joseph's faith in the unseen led him to a place of great purpose and honor. In Genesis 50:20, after all of his trials, Joseph tells his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph could have been bitter, angry, or resentful, but instead, he trusted that God was working in the unseen, that even the hardest moments were part of a greater plan. What a powerful testimony of faith. Joseph's story reminds us that even when we can't see the end of the road, God is already there, working for our good. You might be wondering, how can I trust when I don't see what's coming? The truth is, we don't always have the answers, but that's where trust comes in. Trust is not about knowing everything. It's about knowing that God knows what He's doing. It's about having confidence in His goodness, even when we don't understand the journey. In Hebrews 11:1 we read, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." Faith is not about having everything figured out. It's about having confidence that God is at work, even in the moments we can't see, even when it feels like nothing is happening. The truth is, faith grows the most in the unseen moments. It's in the dark valleys that God shapes us, refines us, and prepares us for the breakthroughs ahead. Think about the Israelites in the wilderness. They had been freed from slavery, but they didn't know where they were going. They wandered for years, uncertain of their destination. They didn't know how long it would take to get to the promised land, but God was with them every step of the way. He provided for them, protected them, and led them through the wilderness. Even when they couldn't see the end of the journey, God was with them in the unseen, guiding them to something greater. God is with you in your own wilderness, in your own season of waiting and uncertainty. Even when you can't see the path ahead, He is already there, guiding you. It might not make sense right now, but trust that God has a plan, and He is working it out, even when you can't see it. It's in those moments of trust that we learn to rely fully on God, to lean into His promises, and to find peace in the midst of the unknown. When we trust in the unseen, we let go of the need to control. We let go of the pressure to have everything figured out. We release the burden of trying to predict the future, and we rest in the knowledge that God has it under control. Trusting in the unseen means surrendering our need for certainty and embracing the mystery of God's plan. It's hard, yes. It's uncomfortable, yes. But it's also the place where God does His most transformative work in us. You may be facing a situation right now that feels uncertain. You may be in a season where the future is unclear. But I want to encourage you today. Trust in the unseen. Trust that God is working even when you can't see it. Trust that He is guiding you even when the road ahead is foggy. Lean into His promises because He is faithful and His plans are always good. In Isaiah 55:8-9, God reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God's ways are higher than ours. His plans are greater than ours. Even when we don't understand, we can trust that He is leading us to something greater than we could ever imagine. Let go of the need to understand everything. Let go of the need to see the full picture. Trust in the unseen and allow God to lead you where you need to go. Number 3, the weight of worry. How many nights have you spent tossing and turning, consumed by worry? The weight of anxiety pulling at your chest, the constant thoughts running through your mind, convincing you that you have to figure it all out right now. How often do we find ourselves trapped in this cycle of worry, thinking that somehow our constant anxiety will solve everything? But let me ask you, does it? Does worrying ever really change anything? The truth is, worry never helps. In fact, it only weighs us down. It steals our peace, clouds our judgment, and keeps us stuck in a state of fear. Yet we often cling to it as if it's a form of control. We think that by worrying, we're being responsible, that we're being proactive, that somehow the more we worry, the more we can prepare for what's coming. But worry isn't preparation. It's an emotional prison that keeps us from the freedom God wants us to have. In Matthew 6:25-27, Jesus speaks directly to the heart of this issue. He says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life?" These words are as relevant today as they were when Jesus spoke them. Worrying about what we can't control doesn't add anything to our lives. In fact, it takes away. It takes our peace, our joy, and our trust in the God who is bigger than our problems. I know that it's not easy. I know that life sometimes feels overwhelming, and it's hard to see how things will work out. The uncertainty of the future, the pressure of responsibilities, and the fears of what could go wrong can make it feel like we have no choice but to worry. But Jesus is clear. Worry is not the answer. It doesn't help. It doesn't change anything. Take a moment and think about the last time you worried about something. How did it make you feel? Anxious, exhausted, fearful? And in the end, did it change the outcome? Worry never fixes the problem. It only magnifies it. But here's the good news. You don't have to carry that weight. You don't have to keep holding on to worry as if it's your burden to bear alone. God invites you to release that weight. He invites you to cast your cares upon Him, to trust that He is big enough to handle whatever you're facing. In 1 Peter 5:7, we are encouraged, "Cast all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you." This isn't just a suggestion. It's an invitation to freedom. God is saying, you don't have to carry this alone. I'm here. I care for you. Imagine the peace that comes when you no longer have to shoulder the weight of worry, when you let go and let God carry it for you. Think about the Israelites. They were trapped in slavery with no way out, no means of escape. They had every reason to be filled with worry. But when God led them out of Egypt, He provided for them every step of the way. Even when they didn't understand what was happening or where they were going, God was with them, providing food, water, and protection. In Exodus 16:4, God says, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you." The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. God didn't give them a month's worth of food all at once. He gave them what they needed, one day at a time, and that's how God works with us. He doesn't always show us the whole picture, but He promises to provide for us each day. We don't have to worry about tomorrow because He's already there, taking care of us. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that if we don't worry, nothing will get done. But worry doesn't change anything. It only steals your joy and peace. It's an illusion of control, a false belief that if we keep thinking about the problem, we'll somehow solve it. But God is the one in control, and He promises to take care of you. The Apostle Paul knew this better than anyone. He wrote in Philippians 4:6-7, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Paul isn't saying that we should ignore our problems or pretend they don't exist. He's saying that instead of worrying, we should pray. Instead of carrying the weight on our own, we should take our concerns to God. And when we do, He promises us peace. A peace that doesn't make sense to the world, a peace that guards our hearts and minds. When we choose to trust God with our worries, we're making a declaration. I trust you more than I trust my own ability to control this situation. It's a choice to surrender, to let go of the weight of anxiety and embrace the peace that comes from trusting in God's provision. But let's be honest, surrendering isn't always easy. We live in a world that tells us to be self-sufficient, to take care of everything ourselves. We're taught to handle our problems, to fix things, to be in control. But God's ways are different. He calls us to surrender, to trust Him with the things we can't control, and to let go of the weight of worry. I want to challenge you today. What are you holding on to that's causing you anxiety? What worries have you been carrying that you weren't meant to carry? It's time to let go. Take those worries, those fears, those anxieties, and give them to God. He's big enough to handle it. You don't have to carry that weight anymore. Jesus offers us peace. He offers us rest. In Matthew 11:28-30, He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus invites you to come to Him, to lay down your worries and find rest in His arms. His yoke is easy, His burden is light, and in Him you'll find the peace your soul longs for. Let go of the weight of worry. Trust that God is in control, that He cares for you, and that He is already working on your behalf. You don't have to carry that burden anymore. Surrender it to Him and let His peace guard your heart and mind. Number 4, patience in the pause. How often do we find ourselves waiting for something? We wait for an opportunity, a breakthrough, an answer to our prayers. The waiting can be agonizing, and during those moments of pause, we often wonder, what am I supposed to do now? It's easy to feel like we're stuck, as though life is on hold and that nothing is moving forward. But what if I told you that those moments of waiting are not wasted? What if the pause is actually preparing you for what's to come? We live in a world that thrives on instant gratification. Everything is quick. Fast food, fast internet, fast responses. And when we have to wait, when things don't happen on our timeline, frustration begins to creep in. We start to wonder if God is hearing us, if He even cares, or if He's forgotten about us. But the truth is, the pause is not a sign of neglect or abandonment. It's a part of God's plan. The waiting is where He works in us. James 5:7-8 says, "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near." James uses the analogy of a farmer to remind us that patience is part of the process. The farmer doesn't plant the seeds and then demand an immediate harvest. No, he waits. He trusts that in time the crop will grow, that the rain will come, and that the harvest will be plentiful. And in the same way, we must wait for God's timing, trusting that He is at work, even when we can't see it. Patience is not passive. It's not about sitting back and doing nothing. Patience is an active choice to trust in God's plan, even when the road ahead is unclear. It's about continuing to move forward in faith, even when we don't know when things will change. The truth is, God is always working, even in the moments of stillness. And it's during these pauses that He prepares us for what's ahead. Think about the story of David. As a young shepherd, David was anointed to be the next king of Israel. But instead of stepping into the palace immediately, he spent years in the wilderness. He ran from Saul, hid in caves, and fought battles. He didn't understand it at the time, but God was preparing him for the role He had called him to. Those years of waiting were not wasted. They were shaping David into the leader God wanted him to be. In 1 Samuel 16:13, we see the moment when David is anointed by the prophet Samuel. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. But that anointing didn't immediately lead to a throne. David had to wait. He had to learn patience, humility, and trust. And through those years of waiting, God was preparing him for something greater than he could have imagined. How many times have you felt like David? You've been given a promise, you've received a calling, but it feels like you're stuck in the wilderness, far from the dream God showed you. It's easy to get discouraged when we don't see the progress we expect. But remember, even in the wilderness, God is working. He is shaping you, teaching you, and building your character. Just as He did with David, He is preparing you for the purpose He has for your life. The pause is not wasted. The Apostle Paul knew all about waiting. He was called to spread the gospel to the Gentiles, but his journey was filled with delays, imprisonment, and opposition. Yet Paul never lost heart. He knew that God's timing was perfect, and even in the waiting, God was using him. In Romans 8:25, Paul writes, "But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently." Patience is not just a virtue. It's a necessity in our walk with God. It's in the waiting that our faith is refined, our trust is deepened, and our hearts are prepared for what God has in store. Patience is also about trust. When we wait patiently, we are saying to God, "I trust that you know what you're doing. I trust that your timing is better than mine." It's an act of surrender, a letting go of our need to control the outcome and trusting that God's plan is unfolding exactly as it should. This can be incredibly difficult, especially when the future seems uncertain, but it's in the pause that we often find our greatest peace. In Isaiah 40:31, we are reminded of the reward for waiting patiently on God. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. The promise is clear. Those who wait on the Lord will be strengthened. When we trust in His timing, when we wait patiently, God renews our strength, giving us the endurance to keep moving forward, even when the path seems long. But waiting doesn't mean doing nothing. It means continuing to do what God has called you to do, even when you don't see immediate results. It means persevering, trusting that each step you take is bringing you closer to the fulfillment of God's promises. Waiting doesn't mean that you stop living or stop working. It means living in faith, trusting that God will make a way when the time is right. There's another example in the Bible of waiting that speaks volumes. The Israelites in the desert. After their deliverance from Egypt, they had to wait 40 years in the wilderness before they could enter the promised land. 40 years. That's a long time to wait, isn't it? But those years were not wasted. They were a time of preparation. God was teaching His people to trust Him, to depend on Him, and to learn obedience. He provided for them daily, giving them manna from heaven and water from a rock. Even in their waiting, God was with them. In Deuteronomy 8:2-3, Moses reminds the Israelites of this important lesson. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep His commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. The Israelites had to wait for the promised land, but in the waiting, they learned to trust in God's provision and faithfulness. The pause was not wasted. It was a time of refining, of deepening their relationship with God. So what do you do in the pause? You wait, but you don't wait passively. You continue to trust. You continue to move forward in faith. You keep praying, keep seeking, and keep trusting that God is at work, even when you can't see it. The waiting is not wasted. It is part of the process, and in God's timing, you will see the fruit of your patience. Patience in the pause isn't easy, but it is essential. It is in the waiting that we grow, that we trust, and that we are prepared for what God has next. Don't rush the process. Trust that God is working, even in the stillness, and that in His perfect timing, the harvest will come. Number 5, the power of stillness. How often do we rush through our days, caught in the whirlwind of responsibilities, commitments, and distractions? We live in a world that values productivity, that tells us we have to constantly move, constantly do, constantly achieve. But what happens when we stop? What happens when we take a step back, when we pause and allow ourselves to simply be still? In the chaos of life, stillness can seem like a luxury we can't afford. We're always moving, always chasing, always striving for the next goal. We think that the more we do, the more successful we'll be, the more peace we'll find. But what if true peace, true strength is found not in doing, but in being still before God? Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." This simple yet profound command is an invitation to rest in the presence of God. It's a reminder that we don't have to do it all ourselves. We don't have to figure everything out, solve every problem, or carry every burden. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is to stop, be still, and trust that God is in control. Being still doesn't mean doing nothing. It's not about sitting idle and waiting for things to happen. It's about pausing long enough to reconnect with God, to hear His voice, to rest in His presence. In stillness, we allow God to speak to our hearts, to renew our strength, and to remind us that He is with us every step of the way. In a world that demands constant activity, it's easy to feel guilty about taking time to be still. We worry that we're wasting time, that we're not doing enough, that we're falling behind. But the Bible tells us that stillness isn't wasted time. It's a time for spiritual renewal. It's a time to remember that we don't have to fight every battle on our own. God is with us, and He is more than capable of handling the challenges we face. Isaiah 40:31 speaks to this. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. When we take time to be still, we open ourselves up to God's strength. It's in the quiet moments of stillness that He renews our energy, gives us clarity, and prepares us for the road ahead. We don't have to wear ourselves out by striving endlessly. God promises to renew us when we pause and wait for His strength. Think about the example of Jesus. Even though He was constantly surrounded by people, always healing, teaching, and serving, He still made time to withdraw and be alone with His Father. In Mark 1:35 we read, "Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house and went off to a solitary place where He prayed." Jesus, in His perfect example, showed us the importance of stillness. He knew that in order to continue His work, He needed to spend time in quiet communion with God. He needed to be still. If Jesus, the Son of God, needed time to be still, how much more do we? Stillness is not a sign of weakness or inactivity. It's a sign of trust. It's an act of faith that says, God, I trust that you are in control. I trust that you are working even when I don't see it. I trust that you are enough. Think about the times in your own life when you've experienced true stillness. Maybe it was a moment in prayer, a time spent in nature, or a quiet evening at home. In those moments, you may have felt God's peace wash over you, His presence fill the space around you. In those moments, you allowed yourself to step out of the hustle and bustle of life and rest in His embrace. And in that rest, you found strength, you found clarity, you found peace. Stillness is a practice, something that requires intentionality. It's not something that comes naturally in a world that's always moving, always demanding, always pushing. But when we make the time to be still, when we prioritize moments of quiet before God, we create space for Him to speak, to guide, and to heal. It's in the stillness that we reconnect with our purpose, that we remember who we are, and that we find the peace that transcends all understanding. Psalm 23, 2-3 tells us, "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul." God knows that we need rest. He knows that we can't keep going at full speed without burning out. And so He calls us to rest in His presence, to lie down in the green pastures He has prepared for us, to be refreshed by His Spirit. It's in these moments of stillness that we find true rest, the kind of rest that renews our souls and equips us to face whatever comes next. When we learn to embrace stillness, we allow God to do a work in us that we can't do for ourselves. We stop striving, stop pushing, and simply rest in the assurance that He is in control. We trust that in the stillness, He is working, He is speaking, and He is preparing us for the journey ahead. I want to encourage you today. Don't be afraid to take time for stillness. Don't feel guilty for stepping away from the chaos and sitting in the presence of God. In the stillness, you will find His peace. You will find His strength. You will find the courage to keep going. So take a deep breath, slow down, and allow yourself to be still before the Lord. He is waiting to meet you there. Number 6, release the burden. How often do we find ourselves weighed down by the burdens of life, the pressures of work, the responsibilities of family, the struggles of personal relationships, the worries about the future? It's easy to feel as though we're carrying a load that's too heavy to bear. And we try, don't we? We try to shoulder it all, thinking that if we just push through, if we just keep going, we'll eventually get to the other side. But what happens when the burden becomes too great? What happens when we realize that we can't do it on our own? The weight of life's challenges can feel overwhelming at times. But I want to tell you something today. You don't have to carry that burden alone. God never intended for you to. The truth is, He wants to take that weight off your shoulders. He wants to help you carry it, to ease the load, and to give you rest. In Matthew 11:28-30, Jesus extends an invitation to each of us. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." These words are a promise that we don't have to carry our burdens alone. Jesus invites us to bring our weariness, our struggles, and our worries to Him. He offers us rest, a rest that only He can provide. So many of us walk through life with a heavy heart, burdened by things that we were never meant to carry. We think that we have to fix everything, that we have to be in control, that we have to handle every problem ourselves. But the truth is, God is bigger than our problems. He is more than capable of carrying the weight we're trying to bear. And when we surrender that burden to Him, we find peace, we find rest, we find freedom. There's a story in the Bible that beautifully illustrates this principle, the story of Peter walking on water. In Matthew 14:28-30, Peter steps out of the boat and begins walking toward Jesus on the water. But when he sees the wind and the waves, he becomes afraid and begins to sink. In verse 31 we read, "Immediately Jesus reached out His hand and caught him. 'You of little faith,' He said, 'why did you doubt?'" In that moment, Peter's fear caused him to take on a burden he wasn't meant to carry. He was focused on the storm, on the waves, on the things that were beyond his control. But Jesus was right there, ready to take the weight of his fear and doubt. And he's right here with you too, ready to take your burdens and give you the peace that surpasses all understanding. You might be wondering, what does it look like to release the burden? It starts with acknowledging that you don't have to handle everything yourself. It means surrendering the need for control, trusting that God will carry the things you can't. It means letting go of the fears, the worries, the anxiety, and the pressure that are weighing you down. And it means giving those burdens to God, trusting that He can handle them far better than you ever could. Psalm 55:22 tells us, "Cast your cares on the Lord, and He will sustain you. He will never let the righteous be shaken." This verse is a beautiful reminder that God doesn't want us to carry our burdens on our own. He's ready and willing to take them from us. When we cast our cares on Him, He promises to sustain us. He promises to give us the strength we need to keep going, even when we feel like we can't. But releasing the burden doesn't always happen overnight. It's a process. It takes time and trust. We have to consciously choose to give our worries to God, day by day, moment by moment. It's not about denying the reality of our struggles. It's about choosing to trust that God is bigger than our problems and that He is with us every step of the way. Think about the Israelites when they were in the desert. They had just been freed from slavery in Egypt, but they found themselves facing a vast desert with no clear way forward. They didn't know where their next meal would come from, how they would survive, or when they would reach the promised land. But God was with them. He provided for them every step of the way, sending manna from heaven, providing water from a rock, guiding them by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Even in their uncertainty, God was there, carrying their burden. He didn't leave them to figure it out on their own, and He won't leave you either. Isaiah 41:10 offers a powerful promise. "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." This is the promise God gives us when we choose to release our burdens to Him. He promises to be with us, to strengthen us, to help us, and to uphold us. We don't have to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. God is with us, and He is more than capable of handling what we cannot. But here's the challenge. We have to trust Him with our burdens. We have to believe that He is strong enough to carry them, that He is faithful enough to help us. And that means letting go of our own need to control the outcome. It means trusting that God's way is better than ours, that His timing is perfect, and that He will sustain us through the storms. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, Paul writes, "But He said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me.'" Paul learned that in his weakness God's grace was enough. In our struggles, in our burdens, God's grace is more than enough. It is through our weakness that God's power is displayed, and it is in releasing our burdens to Him that we find the strength we need. So today, I want to encourage you to release your burden. Whatever it is that you've been carrying, whatever is weighing heavy on your heart, give it to God. Trust that He is with you, that He is carrying it for you, and that He will sustain you. You don't have to bear it alone. Surrender it to Him and allow Him to replace your burden with His peace. Number 7, surrender your timing. How often do we find ourselves looking at the clock, waiting for the right moment to make a move? We want things to happen, and we want them to happen now. Our impatience creeps in, and we can't help but push forward, believing that if we just work harder or rush things along, we'll get to where we want to be faster. We think that our timing is perfect, that if we just speed up the process, we'll be in control. But what if the right timing is not ours to determine? What if God's timing is the key to everything? We live in a world that teaches us to hurry, to race against the clock, to accomplish more and faster. But the truth is, we often end up frustrated, tired, and out of sync with the peace that God wants to give us. We miss out on His perfect plan because we're so focused on our own timeline. But I want to encourage you to think differently. Maybe it's not about how fast you can go, but about how well you can surrender your timing to God and trust His. The Bible is filled with examples of people who had to wait for God's perfect timing. Consider the story of Abraham. God promised him that he would be the father of many nations, but after years of waiting, Abraham and Sarah grew impatient. They tried to take matters into their own hands by having a child through Sarah's servant Hagar, but that wasn't God's plan, and it led to complications and heartache. In Genesis 17:15-16, God spoke to Abraham, "As for Sarai your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai, her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." It wasn't until they surrendered their timeline and trusted God's perfect timing that Isaac, the promised son, was born. Waiting on God's timing isn't easy, especially when we don't see the outcome right away. It's easy to get discouraged, to wonder if God has forgotten us or if He even cares. But time and time again, the Bible shows us that God's timing is always perfect, even when we don't understand it. He doesn't work on our schedule, but His plan is far better than anything we could try to rush into. In Ecclesiastes 3:1, we read, "There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens." The truth is, God's timing is perfect because He knows what's best for us. He sees the bigger picture, the whole journey, and He's not rushing to get us to our destination. He's more concerned with the process, the ways He is shaping us, teaching us, and growing us in the waiting. Think about the life of Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused and imprisoned. Joseph received a dream from God that he would one day rule over his family. But years of hardship and waiting followed. Yet, throughout it all, Joseph trusted that God's timing was at work, even when he couldn't see how it would unfold. Eventually, Joseph was placed in a position of power in Egypt, just as God had promised, and he was able to save many lives during a time of famine. In Genesis 45:5, Joseph said to his brothers, "And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Joseph's faith in God's timing enabled him to forgive his brothers and see the bigger picture of God's plan, even in the midst of hardship. Waiting can be painful. It's hard when we feel like we're ready for something, but the doors just aren't opening. It's frustrating when the timing doesn't match our own expectations, but the Bible assures us that God is working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. He is preparing us for something greater than we could imagine, and sometimes that requires waiting. Isaiah 55:8-9 reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." We cannot always see or understand the timing of God's plan, but just because we don't see the end result doesn't mean that He isn't at work. God's ways are higher than ours, and His timing is always perfect. Surrendering our timing doesn't mean we stop moving forward. It doesn't mean we stop working toward our goals or pursuing our dreams. It means that we trust God with the timing of our lives. It means we stop trying to force things to happen and allow Him to open the doors when the time is right. It means we stop worrying about when the breakthrough will come and trust that God is orchestrating everything in His perfect timing. Psalm 37:7 says, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes." This verse calls us to rest in God's timing and trust that He is in control, even when it seems like everyone around us is rushing ahead. It's a reminder that we don't need to worry about what others are doing or how fast they're moving. We need to trust in the pace that God has set for us. The Apostle Paul experienced this tension between wanting things to happen on his timeline and trusting in God's timing. In 2 Corinthians 12:9 he writes, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me.'" Paul learned that God's timing wasn't always about achieving success in the way he expected, but about trusting in God's grace, even in the waiting. In the waiting, God is doing something in us. He's refining our character, teaching us patience, and growing our trust in Him. The season of waiting may not always make sense, but it's part of the process. Trusting in God's timing is about knowing that He is good, that He has a plan, and that His plan is better than anything we could rush to on our own. So, today I want to encourage you to release your need to control the timing. Surrender it to God and trust that He is working in the waiting. Trust that His timing is perfect, and that when the moment is right, He will open the doors and lead you into the next season of your life. You don't have to rush ahead. You don't have to force things to happen. Just wait, trust, and know that God is in control. Number 8, the strength of waiting. In a world where everything is fast-paced, where instant gratification has become the norm, waiting can feel like the hardest thing to do. We live in a society that values quick results, immediate rewards, and constant progress. The longer we wait for something, the more frustrated we can become. And when we don't see things moving forward as quickly as we expect, it's easy to question whether we're on the right path, whether God is even listening, or whether we're just wasting time. But I want to challenge you to think differently about waiting. What if waiting isn't a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength? What if it's in the waiting that we find our deepest strength? The Bible shows us time and time again that waiting is not a passive activity. It's an active choice that requires faith, trust, and perseverance. Waiting requires us to exercise patience, to hold on to hope even when the outcome is unclear, and to trust that God is working behind the scenes. It's during these times of waiting that we grow stronger, more resilient, and more dependent on God. In Isaiah 40:31, we find a powerful promise. "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." Waiting doesn't mean that we're sitting idly by. It doesn't mean that we're doing nothing. In fact, waiting is a time of renewal, a time of strengthening. When we wait on God, we are renewed and empowered by His presence. We gain the strength we need to keep moving forward, even when the journey seems long. Think about how the process of waiting strengthens us. Have you ever had to wait for something important? Maybe it was a dream, a goal, or a promise that you've been believing for. The waiting can feel unbearable at times, but it's also a time of growth. It's in the waiting that we learn to trust God more fully. It's in the waiting that our faith is refined, that our character is shaped, and that we are prepared for what's to come. The Bible is full of examples of people who had to wait on God's timing, and in their waiting they grew stronger in their faith. One of the best-known examples is the story of Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but Abraham had to wait years before that promise was fulfilled. During that waiting period, Abraham's faith was tested and refined. In Genesis 17:5, God says to him, "No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." Abraham didn't see the fulfillment of God's promise right away. He had to wait, but in that waiting, God was preparing him, strengthening him, and building his faith. Waiting doesn't just strengthen our faith, it also teaches us humility. The Israelites, for example, were in the wilderness for 40 years before entering the Promised Land. 40 years of wandering, 40 years of waiting. But those years weren't wasted. God used that time to teach them to depend on Him, to trust in His provision, and to recognize that He was their source of strength. In Deuteronomy 8:2-3 we read, "Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years, to humble and test you, in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." Waiting isn't just about passing time. It's about being shaped, refined, and humbled so that we can receive the blessings God has prepared for us. There is strength that comes from waiting on God, from trusting in His timing, and from allowing Him to work in us during the waiting period. But this strength isn't always evident to the outside world. The world may see us waiting and think we're stagnant, that we're not moving forward. But God sees us differently. He sees the strength being built in us, the faith being tested, and the character being shaped. The waiting is not wasted. It's during this time that God is doing a deep work in us that prepares us for the future He has planned. Think about the way a muscle is strengthened. When you exercise, you don't see the results immediately. You have to wait for the muscle fibers to repair and rebuild, but over time, they grow stronger. The same is true in our spiritual lives. Waiting on God builds strength in us, even when we don't see the immediate results. It's a process that requires trust and perseverance, but it's a process that strengthens us for the long journey ahead. David, too, is another example of someone who had to wait for God's timing. As a young man, he was anointed by Samuel to be the next king of Israel. But it wasn't until many years later that he actually took the throne. During that time, David faced many trials. He was pursued by King Saul, faced betrayal, and lived in hiding. But in the midst of these trials, David grew stronger. In Psalm 27:14, David writes, "Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord." Waiting doesn't just test our patience, it strengthens our hearts, it builds resilience, and it teaches us to rely on God more deeply. But waiting also requires us to be content with God's plan, even when we don't understand it. We might want to rush through the process, but God knows exactly what He's doing. He is preparing us for something greater, something beyond what we can imagine. In Philippians 4:11-12, Paul says, "I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want." Paul knew that waiting and being content in that waiting was a key to growing stronger in our faith. As we wait, God strengthens us, teaches us, and prepares us for the future He has planned. We don't have to rush the process. Waiting is part of His plan for our lives. And when the time is right, when His perfect timing unfolds, we will see the fruit of our patience, our trust, and our endurance. So, in this moment, I encourage you to embrace the strength of waiting. Don't see it as wasted time, but as a time of growth, renewal, and preparation. Trust that God is working in the waiting, and that He is building strength in you that will sustain you for the journey ahead. Waiting is not easy, but it is where we are shaped, refined, and prepared for the future God has for us. And when the time is right, He will bring the breakthrough. Until then, we wait with strength, with hope, and with trust in His perfect plan. Number 9, let God open the doors. Have you ever tried to open a door that simply won't budge? Maybe it was a door you thought would lead to your next opportunity, your next season of growth, or your next breakthrough. You pushed, you knocked, you even tried to force it open, but no matter how hard you tried, it remained closed. How many of us have spent so much time and energy trying to open doors that weren't meant for us to walk through? What if, instead of forcing doors open, we learned to trust God to open the right ones at the right time? There's something incredibly freeing about realizing that not every door is ours to open. In fact, the Bible teaches us that God is the one who opens doors for us, and when He does, no one can shut them. When we try to force open doors that God hasn't opened, We risk walking through paths that weren't part of his plan. But when we trust him, when we wait for his timing and his guidance, he will open the doors that lead us where we need to go. In Revelation 3:7-8, Jesus speaks about the authority he has to open and close doors. What he opens no one can shut, and what he shuts no one can open. I know your deeds. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. This is a powerful reminder that God is the one who controls the doors in our lives. When he opens a door, no one can close it. And when he closes a door, no one can open it. We don't have to strive, force, or worry about the doors that seem closed to us. We simply need to trust that God knows what is best for us, and when the time is right, he will open the right doors. Think about the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt. For years, they had been in slavery, waiting for the promised deliverance. And when the moment finally came, they were faced with an obstacle, the Red Sea. The sea was in front of them, and Pharaoh's army was closing in behind them. It seemed like there was no way out. But God, in his perfect timing, opened a way where there seemed to be no way. In Exodus 14:21-22, we read, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left." God opened a door for them that no one could have imagined. He made a way when there seemed to be no way. This is the kind of God we serve, the God who opens doors in the most unexpected ways. The Israelites didn't have to fight to open that door. They didn't have to struggle to make the sea part. They simply had to trust God and walk through the door he opened for them. And in the same way, we are called to trust that God knows what doors need to be opened in our lives. He sees the way forward, even when we can't. So many times we get discouraged when doors seem closed. We might be praying for a job, for a relationship, or for a new opportunity, but the doors stay shut. We might wonder, why is this happening? Why isn't God answering my prayers? But what we often don't realize is that God has a better plan. Sometimes he's closing doors that would lead us down paths that aren't aligned with his purpose for our lives. Sometimes he's protecting us from something that we can't see. And sometimes he's just waiting for the right moment to open the door that will lead us into the next chapter of our lives. Isaiah 55:8-9 tells us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." We don't always understand why some doors are closed, but we can trust that God's plans are always better than our own. He sees the bigger picture. He knows what we need before we even ask, and he is faithful to open the doors that will bring us into the place where he wants us to be. In 2 Corinthians 2:12, Paul writes about how God opens doors for ministry. "Now when I went to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ and found that the Lord had opened a door for me, I still had no peace of mind because I did not find my brother Titus there." Even in the midst of uncertainty, Paul trusted that God had opened a door for him. And that's the key. When God opens a door, it's not always going to look the way we expect. Sometimes the open door is followed by challenges, uncertainties, and even setbacks. But we can trust that when God opens the door, he will also equip us to walk through it. Think about your own life for a moment. What doors have you been trying to open on your own? Maybe it's a job you've been desperately trying to get, a relationship you've been pushing for, or a dream that you've been chasing. And maybe, just maybe, those doors are closed because God has something better for you. What if, instead of trying to force your way through, you let go and trusted that God will open the right doors at the right time? Proverbs 3:5-6 encourages us to trust in God's timing and direction. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." God's path for us is always the right path. We don't have to force things to happen. We simply have to trust him and follow the doors he opens. There's also something powerful about waiting for God to open doors in his timing. When we wait, we learn to trust, not just in the outcome, but in the process. We learn to trust that God is working behind the scenes, orchestrating everything in his perfect plan. And when he opens the door, we know it's the right time, the right opportunity, and the right direction. So today, I want to encourage you to stop trying to force open doors. Trust that God knows exactly which doors need to be opened for you. When the time is right, he will open the door that leads you to the next season of your life. And when he does, walk through it with confidence, knowing that he has prepared the way. Number 10. Stop forcing what's not meant to be. Have you ever found yourself trying to force something to happen, even when deep down you knew it wasn't meant to be? You've given it your all, your energy, your time, your heart. But despite your best efforts, things just don't seem to align. It's as if the universe or even God is saying, "This is not for you." Yet you persist, pushing harder, believing that if you just try a little bit more, if you just give a little bit more of yourself, things will work out. But what if I told you that there is strength in knowing when to stop, when to let go, and when to trust that what's meant for you will come without force? We often find ourselves in situations where we try to control the outcome. Maybe it's a relationship, a job, or a dream that we desperately want to come to fruition. We try to force things to happen, believing that persistence and effort will be enough. But what we often fail to realize is that forcing something that isn't meant to be can lead to frustration, heartache, and unnecessary stress. God doesn't call us to chase after things that he hasn't prepared for us. Instead, he invites us to trust in his timing, his plan, and his purpose for our lives. There's a powerful lesson in the life of Abraham and Sarah. God had promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. But after many years of waiting for the promised son, Sarah became impatient. She took matters into her own hands and encouraged Abraham to have a child with her servant, Hagar. In Genesis 16:2, Sarah says to Abraham, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." There they tried to force God's promise to happen in their own time. And as a result, it led to conflict and pain. It wasn't until much later, when Abraham and Sarah were both far beyond childbearing age, that God fulfilled his promise through Sarah, and Isaac was born. The story of Abraham and Sarah teaches us that when we try to force something that isn't part of God's plan, we often create more problems than solutions. God's timing is always perfect, and his plans for us are far better than anything we could try to orchestrate on our own. We don't have to manipulate situations, relationships, or outcomes. When we stop forcing things and trust in God's plan, we can experience peace, knowing that he is in control. In Psalm 127:1 we are reminded, "Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain." This verse highlights the futility of trying to build something on our own strength. When we try to force things to happen, we are working in vain. But when we trust God and allow him to build what he has planned for us, we can rest assured that it will be done in his perfect way and timing. Think about the story of the Israelites as they waited for the promised land. God had promised them a land flowing with milk and honey, but the journey to that promise wasn't easy. After their deliverance from Egypt, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. During this time, they became impatient, and they often tried to take matters into their own hands. They grumbled, complained, and even built a golden calf to worship, thinking they could control their situation. But their actions only delayed their entry into the promised land. It wasn't until they stopped trying to force things and began to trust God's timing that they were able to step into the blessing he had for them. In Exodus 13:17-18 we read, "When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. God's plan for the Israelites was not the quickest or easiest route, but it was the right one. Sometimes the path God takes us on isn't the one we would choose, but it's always the one that leads to His best for us. Trying to force things can lead us down the wrong path, but trusting in God's plan leads us to where He wants us to be. In Proverbs 3:5-6 we are told, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." This is a reminder that when we stop trying to force things and trust God with our lives, He will guide us down the right path. Our understanding is limited, but God sees the bigger picture. We don't have to know all the details or control every situation. All we have to do is trust Him and allow Him to lead us. For many of us, this is a hard lesson to learn. We are conditioned to believe that we have to fight for everything, that if we don't put in 110% effort, we won't succeed. But God doesn't want us to exhaust ourselves chasing after things that aren't meant for us. He wants us to trust Him and know that He is working on our behalf. The Bible tells us that God's plans for us are good, and that He will provide for us in every area of our lives. In Jeremiah 29:11, we are reminded of this truth. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." God's plans for us are full of hope. He knows what is best for us, and when we trust Him, we can rest in the assurance that He will lead us to the right places at the right time. So today, I encourage you to stop forcing what's not meant to be. Let go of the need to control every aspect of your life. Trust that God is already at work in ways you can't see, opening doors and guiding your steps. When you surrender your plans to Him and trust in His timing, you will find peace. You don't have to strive. You don't have to push. Just trust, let go, and allow God to bring to pass what He has prepared for you. Number 11. Trust beyond what you understand. Have you ever faced a situation where everything seemed uncertain, where the path ahead was unclear, and you had no idea how things would work out? It's in these moments, when we don't have all the answers, that trusting God can be the most difficult thing to do. We want to understand everything, we want to see the full picture, and we want clarity before we take the next step. But sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is trust God, even when we don't understand the situation, and even when the answers aren't immediately clear. It's in these moments of uncertainty that our faith is tested. We find ourselves at a crossroads, standing in the midst of a storm, and we are forced to decide whether we will trust God with what we don't understand. It's easy to trust God when everything is going according to plan, when the road is smooth and the answers are clear. But what happens when things take a turn we didn't expect? What happens when the road gets rocky and the answers aren't coming fast enough? Will we still trust? In Proverbs 3:5-6 we are told, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." These verses challenge us to trust in God even when we can't see the way forward. We are called to lean not on our own understanding because our understanding is limited. God sees the whole picture and He knows what is best for us. He doesn't require us to have all the answers. He simply asks us to trust Him, to submit our lives to Him, and to allow Him to lead us, even when the path ahead is unclear. Think about the story of Job. Job was a man who experienced unimaginable loss. His wealth, his health, and his children were all taken from him. In the midst of his suffering, Job couldn't understand why these things were happening. He questioned God, he wrestled with his pain, but he still chose to trust. Job 13:15 says, "Though He slay me, yet will I hope in Him. I will surely defend my ways to His face." Job didn't have all the answers, but he trusted God beyond what he understood. Even when everything around him seemed to be falling apart, Job chose to hold on to his faith. And in the end, God restored everything to him, his wealth, his health, and his family, greater than before. The story of Job reminds us that even in the most difficult times, when we don't understand the reason behind our struggles, we are still called to trust God. Trusting beyond what we understand means surrendering our need for answers and choosing to believe that God is good, even when life doesn't make sense. Another example of trusting beyond what we understand is the story of Abraham, when God asked him to sacrifice his son, Isaac. Abraham had waited for years for the promised son, and now God was asking him to give up the very thing he had waited for. In Genesis 22:2, God tells Abraham, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Abraham didn't understand why God would ask such a thing, but he trusted. He obeyed, even though it didn't make sense, and God provided a ram as a substitute sacrifice, sparing Isaac's life. God tested Abraham's faith, and Abraham trusted beyond his understanding. Sometimes we will face situations where we simply don't have the answers. We may never understand why certain things happen in our lives, but trusting God beyond our understanding is not about having all the answers. It's about trusting in God's character, in His goodness, and in His ability to work all things together for our good, even when we can't see the outcome. Isaiah 55:8-9 reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God's ways are higher than ours. His understanding is beyond ours. We may not always understand why things happen the way they do, but we can trust that God's plan is perfect, even when it doesn't make sense to us. It's in the moments of uncertainty, when we don't have the answers, that we are called to trust God even more. Trust is not about knowing all the details. It's about knowing that God is faithful, that He is good, and that He has a plan for our lives. Even when we can't see the road ahead, we can trust that He will guide us, that He will provide for us, and that He will never leave us. Psalm 9:10 says, "Those who know your name trust in you, for you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you." When we know God's character, when we know that He is faithful and trustworthy, we can trust Him even when we don't have all the answers. God has never forsaken those who trust in Him, and He never will. He will walk with us through the unknown, and He will lead us to where we need to go. It's easy to trust God when everything is going well, but it's in the moments of uncertainty that our trust is truly tested. Will we trust Him when we don't have the answers? Will we trust Him when the road is unclear? Trusting beyond what we understand means letting go of our need for control and choosing to rest in the assurance that God knows what He's doing. So today, I encourage you to trust beyond what you understand. Surrender your need for answers and choose to trust God with the things that are beyond your comprehension. Trust that His ways are higher than your ways, and that He is leading you to a place of purpose and peace, even when you can't see the path ahead. God is faithful, and He will lead you even through the unknown. Number 12, the peace of letting go. How often do we find ourselves holding on to things that are weighing us down? We hold on to the past, to regrets, to fears about the future, and even to situations or relationships that drain us. We convince ourselves that if we just keep holding on, we can control the outcome. But what if the key to finding peace isn't in holding tighter, but in letting go? What if the true peace that we seek comes from releasing the things that are holding us back and trusting God to take control? Letting go is not easy. It requires us to surrender our desire to control every situation, every relationship, and every outcome. It requires trust, a trust that God has a better plan, even when we don't understand it. And it's in that trust, in that release of control, that we find peace. The Bible is filled with verses that remind us of the peace that comes from letting go and surrendering to God's will. In Philippians 4:6-7, Paul encourages us with these words: "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Paul tells us that instead of holding on to our worries and anxieties, we are to release them to God. When we surrender our concerns to Him, He promises to give us peace, a peace that surpasses all understanding. This peace isn't something we can manufacture or control on our own. It comes only from God when we let go and trust in His ability to handle everything in our lives. So many of us struggle with anxiety and stress because we are holding on to things that were never meant for us to carry. We worry about the future, about our families, our jobs, our health, and so much more. We try to control outcomes, fearing that if we don't, things will spiral out of control. But what we don't realize is that the more we try to control, the more we lose peace. We become overwhelmed, anxious, and consumed with worry. The truth is, God never intended for us to bear those burdens alone. He invites us to give them to Him, to let go and allow Him to take over. In 1 Peter 5:7 we are reminded, "Cast all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you." This is a simple yet profound invitation. God cares for us deeply, and He wants to carry our burdens. When we release our anxiety to Him, we are acknowledging that He is the one who has control. We are choosing to trust that He is bigger than our problems and that His plans are greater than anything we can manage on our own. Consider the example of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was facing the greatest trial of His life, and He knew what was coming. He would be betrayed, arrested, and ultimately crucified. In this moment of deep anguish, He prayed, not for His own will, but for God's will to be done. In Matthew 26:39 we read, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Jesus, in His humanity, desired to avoid the suffering that lay ahead, but He chose to surrender His will to God's plan. He chose to let go of His own desires and trust that God's way was the right way. And in that surrender, He found peace. The peace of knowing that He was walking in alignment with God's will. Letting go doesn't always mean that we understand what's happening or that we are free from pain or difficulty. It means trusting that God is with us, even in the hardest moments, and that He will bring us through to the other side. When we let go of the need to control, we open ourselves up to the peace that comes from God's presence. It's the peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, but on the assurance that God is in control and that He is working all things together for our good. In John 14:27, Jesus says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." The peace Jesus offers is not the peace that the world gives, a peace that is dependent on external circumstances or temporary situations. No, the peace Jesus gives is a deep, inner peace that comes from knowing that He is with us, that He is in control, and that He has already overcome the world. This peace is unshakable. It is the peace that comes when we let go and trust God with our lives. There's another beautiful example in the Bible that illustrates the peace of letting go, the story of Mary and Martha. In Luke 10:38-42, we see two sisters, each with a different approach to the situation at hand. Martha is busy with all the preparations for their guests, running around trying to make everything perfect. But Mary, on the other hand, chooses to sit at Jesus' feet, listening to Him and soaking in His presence. Martha is frustrated and asks Jesus to tell Mary to help her, but Jesus responds in verse 42, "Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." Mary let go of the distractions and chose the peace that comes from simply being in God's presence. In that moment of surrender, she experienced the peace of letting go. We often find ourselves like Martha, caught up in the busyness of life, trying to control everything around us. But what we don't realize is that when we choose to let go, when we choose to surrender our worries and our need for control, we open ourselves up to the peace that comes from being in God's presence. It's in those moments of stillness, of surrender, that we find the true peace we've been searching for. Letting go is not a sign of weakness, it's an act of trust. It's trusting that God is big enough to handle our worries, our pain, our desires, and our future. It's trusting that His plan is better than our own, and that He is leading us towards something greater than we could imagine. When we release control and let God take over, we find peace, the peace that surpasses all understanding, the peace that guards our hearts and minds. Today, I encourage you to let go, whatever it is that you are holding on to, whatever it is that is weighing you down, release it to God. Trust that He will carry it for you. Let go of the fear, the worry, the anxiety, and embrace the peace that comes from surrendering to His will. God is in control, and His peace is available to you. Let go, and let His peace fill your heart.